Welcome to the AIMHO 365 webinar, Constructing a Culture of Evaluative Storytelling, presented by Taylor Tackett from Boise State University. I'm Shadeen Say from the AIMHO 365 committee. A big thank you to you, Taylor, for developing this presentation and offering to share this knowledge with the region. We will be taking questions during the presentation using the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. If everyone logged in can test the chat feature by typing in your campus name as well as how many attendees are viewing with you today, we'd greatly appreciate it. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the AIMHO 365 YouTube page, and the link is available through the aimho.org website. So be sure to check it back out as you need to use it for training or just refresher purposes. Please be checking the AIMHO website often for future webinars, as well as to submit webinar proposals. We are always looking for more knowledge and information from our region to share. At the end of this webinar, there will be a short survey, so if you have time and don't mind filling it out, we would greatly appreciate it. Again, a huge thank you to our presenter today. Taylor, we're all yours.
Welcome, everyone. How are you all doing today? I know I can't necessarily hear you, but I am glad that you are with me today. So we are doing Assessment 102, Creating a Culture of Evaluative Storytelling. Wanted to give you a little bit of context about who I am. For the past 3 years here, I've been at Boise State University. I'm currently serving as the Assistant Director for Community Standards. And individually for me, I have some background in student union management. I focus a lot on student conduct, housing and residence life, and student retention initiatives in higher education. And I've spent some time here in Idaho and as well at a couple institutions back in Ohio where I am originally from. As far as Boise State Housing and Residence Life Program, we currently have about 80 staff members working with us within 8 functional areas in our department, and we're supporting about 3,500 on-campus student beds. And we are opening a new 600 bed space residence hall this next year, so we're pretty pumped about that. Housing and Residence Life at Boise State is an auxiliary function, though we do sit under the umbrella of student affairs. So for us, we are generally self-sustaining financially. And one of the big things to note that I'll be talking about a little later in the presentation is how our maintenance and custodial crew are separate from the facility operations and management department for the rest of the university. So we do have some folks that serve us specifically. We are really all about cooperative work here at Boise State. So we try to get everyone connected that's working with us in a way and be as intentional as possible with our student experience. So to give you an example of that, we hold a weekly vision meeting where we discuss where we are as a department and where we're hoping to go. So at times this provides us the space and time for some professional development and a time to talk about things like our occupancy assessment initiatives that we're doing in the department, and then personal success stories from any and all of our staff members that wish to share that. Also, about 3 years ago when I came here to Boise State, our department specifically had experienced a lot of staffing changes, which is important context to know as we move through this. We had a director change, we had some reorganization of assistant and associate directors along with new staff coming in for that. We integrated 2 new coordinator positions, and almost all of our resident director team turned over. So it was a pretty big time, and so we identified that as a pretty good opportunity for us to make some pretty big changes at the time. So I was charged with developing a sustainability assessment initiative here in Housing and Residence Life. And at Boise State, I was the first person with that officially built into my workload and what I was doing. As a side note, I just want to say you're all pretty cool people. I'm glad you're joining me today. It takes a special kind of student affairs professional to willingly jump and dig a little deeper into assessment work. So I'm excited to share our journey over the past 3 years with you all, and hopefully it can provide you some tips and tricks for folks who are interested in creating a higher level assessment initiative in your department. So I kind of wanted to go over our learning outcomes today, or some of the goals that I hope we can walk out with. So first, I want us to be able at the end of this conversation to identify our designed experiences within our functional areas. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that means shortly. I want us to begin to think and develop sustainable tools for assessment as we move through this process, and then ultimately identify feedback loops and relationships that will enhance the evaluative storytelling techniques that we'll talk a little bit about today. So to give you some context with the conversation we're about to have, I'm assuming that there is some base level knowledge regarding assessment for you all. So I'm not really focusing on how to facilitate assessment in your residence halls, for instance. I'm really talking about creating a system that creates good storytelling so we can identify what our students are thinking, what they need, and what they want. So through that, I'm hoping you understand some quantitative and qualitative data techniques, whether that's interviewing styles, coding, and the like. So from this, I could find, I really focused when I was building this, I couldn't find anything on how to create systems of assessment in our departments that matched what our divisional priorities were requiring and the learning outcomes of the university, while also serving our students in a way that resonated with the mission that we had identified. I do want to note that I know that every housing and residence life department is different. They have their own style, their own goals, and their own needs. So this is only perhaps one way of approaching creating a strategic plan revolving around types and quality of information that we're collecting for assessment. It's a way to organize and streamline this information, all while getting folks to be connected and involved. So to start this out, the big question for us is what do we want our students to learn? This was a starting place for us in this process. So we knew that it was really important for us to include all members of our team. That was, connecting back to our commitment to really doing that cooperative work in our department. So recently, before I joined Boise State, the department, under the new leadership of our director, created a new mission, vision, and values for the department. So this was a good bedrock place for us to start. So this was really the driving force behind this question. So we extended one of our vision meetings, which we currently hold on Thursday afternoons, to be a whole afternoon to set aside some time. We utilized every staff member in our department. We pulled everyone together, and we started writing down what our pain points were, what our success stories were, and the like. And this was really with the goal of ascertaining how individual jobs and interactions give something to our students. So we parsed this down, and we were able to create the following learning outcomes. So I know that this may be a little bit hard for you to see, but in column 1, we created a total of 5 learning outcomes, and we're extending this next year to have a 6th operational excellence outcome. But our first learning outcome, students will be able to describe their personal characteristics, including but not limited to background, identities, communication styles, learning styles, strengths, skills that influence how they act and make decisions and interact with others. So beginning this process, a lot of folks in our department didn't understand or know a lot about assessment, so we wanted to put a few internal applications, things that people could identify and latch onto to make something really tangible with this particular learning outcome. Number 2, so students will be able to apply critical reflection and problem-solving strategies to everyday situations, and then we identified different areas as well there. Number 3, students will be able to describe how they influence others and the communities in which they interact. 4, students will develop the life skills to navigate resources and live independently. 5, students will be able to demonstrate the ability to understand, appreciate, and connect to others. So we really wanted to move from the top, our first learning outcome, with a focus on self, down to community being number 5, because that is really important to us, and that's reflected in our mission, vision, and values. So for us, this is really what our base level, we got all this information collected, this is where we wanted to start from. If we had in place what we were hoping for that students would learn from our department, we could then kind of link those back to divisional priorities and institutional outcomes later on. So from here, I was really ready to start with our department constructing our designed experience. So the first step in that is understanding what our goals were. We really wanted to make sure as we built an assessment plan or strategic plan for us as a department that we were really focusing what we were already doing, building that out and creating that space for our folks in the department to understand that. So we really wanted to make sure that we had tactics to keep productivity and information flowing while not introducing new work for folks, because that felt a little heavy for some people. So everyone is a little bit scared when it comes to assessment when we talk about it, because they're maybe feeling the fear of feeling inept, or the fear of feeling incompetent. They didn't want to mess up, and obviously none of us would love additional work. So through that, we were really trying to focus on information we currently gather, unify that, removing any duplicating information or unnecessary work that isn't really aligning with our learning outcomes or the mission, vision, and values of our department. So this is one place where I noticed that something was a little weird while we were collecting this information. Some staff members in our department were clearly connected to the mission of educating students, but also some others weren't. This led me to ask a series of questions that helped me comprehend and understand some of the work that we were trying to do and trying to collect from folks. So the first question I asked in building our designed experience was, did the team get to be a part of the process to create learning outcomes? So when we sat down and we were trying to parse through the kinds of things that we wanted students to learn as a result of living with us, we noticed really two big dichotomous areas. Individuals connect to our res ed functions or our res left functions were more reflective of the picture on the right. They viewed themselves as the individual in blue. They were connection builders. They were there to help facilitate learning in groups for students. And on the other end, we had folks like our custodial and maintenance staff who identified with the picture on the left as a faceless snowman. So in this particular exercise, we gave them different art mediums to kind of express how they were feeling about some of the learning that was happening in our residence halls. So we began to understand that some people were feeling really disconnected from our mission to educate. So with that, we wanted to make sure that we were building them in and getting them connected in a bigger way. So the second question we are interested in understanding is, do we understand how each role is expected to impact the student experience through the learning outcomes and divisional priorities? We wanted to make sure that because we knew that some folks were feeling disconnected, was there a way for us to make sure that through their jobs we help them understand how they might impact learning in our residence halls, for instance? So the third question and the last question we are interested in asking is each individual able to specifically identify how they contribute to learning outcomes from the department? So we wanted to create two different scenarios. We wanted them to understand how their teams or their functional areas, be it our business office, our guest and conference services area, residential education, or residence life, as a group impacted student learning. But we also wanted people to individually be able to identify in their own role what impacts they may have on students. So this is a screenshot of an example of our plan. So we had the functional area there on the left. We identified individuals in that functional area who this might impact. And then as a group, we went through each learning outcome and we identified 3 to 5 things where they might impact student learning in that particular area, or where they might have things that they would impact with that learning outcome. So with this, our next step was start to identify what we all do in each of our functional areas. So I'm sorry, I'm stepping back a little bit. We didn't really understand who was doing what in each of their roles. So we wanted to understand when we asked people what each person was doing in their role, they couldn't necessarily say, like, I know that a resident director does X, Y, and Z to facilitate community in their area. So we wanted to make sure we were understanding how we coordinate with them. How do we make our assessment better by sharing data? So we had a pretty big culture of data hoarding here. And how might we recognize when there's something valuable to share? So essentially, we placed large sticky notes around the room, and everyone went around and wrote on these for each of their functional areas, which was represented in this slide going back one. And this really was twofold. They were able to focus on identifying what other functional areas do that impacted the work that they do. So a resident director was able to say, I find it really valuable when we see occupancy reports from our housing operations area because it drives this and this and this for our data knowledge. But it also helps making sure that individuals also knew what information was valuable to others that they were producing that maybe they previously weren't aware of at that time. So with that, we moved to designed experience in creating our learning outcome from multiple functional areas. I wanted our next step was really to go through and sit with each leader in each functional area department and make sure that we were aligning things with our divisional priorities, which revolved around recruitment, retention, and employability of our students. So once we had identified what each individual did in their role and also in their functional area, we're able to sit down and start saying, okay, these are the things that are really important, and start drawing those out. So we wanted to know who uses our programs and services, how are people getting contacted with our business office, for instance. What are other institutions doing here that maybe we are either doing or not doing? And this was a test in futility at the time, because we weren't really looking at expanding what we were doing, just focusing on what we had. We wanted to make sure we were comparing to national standards. We utilize EBI Sky Factor here at this institution, so we knew some of the things and some of the areas that we might need to focus on and dig a little bit deeper. We wanted to make sure we were looking at cost effectiveness, especially in our business, our operations, and our maintenance and custodial areas. We wanted to see how we were impacting student learning through our various programs, both in Res Ed and Res Life, through student conduct and through our leadership programming. We wanted to make sure we were looking at the qualitative assessments that we've done historically and pulling out some of the student needs that we have either been unable or unwilling at the time to entertain. We wanted to take a look at student cultures in the campus environment. So we wanted to make sure that as we were building this program, we were not creating too many assessments in one particular area, eventually resulting in some assessment fatigue or survey fatigue for our students. And we also wanted to make sure folks were satisfied, which a lot of that data came out of EBI Sky Factor. So to kind of outline that in the first way, what we did is we took, this is an example of each learning outcome. So we took each functional area and we started identifying what goals, once we identified what particular things would be assessed in that area. And we logged it. We logged it by learning outcome. So this is the first learning outcome that we have. The second column there is each program or service offering that we may have. What goal is being assessed, who's responsible for that, where we're pulling that data from. So what is our method and what is the tool being used? And ultimately, what you're seeing here on the screen is an active report. So at the top in a red block there, you'll see that there's an opportunity for folks, once they've completed a piece of assessment which they've identified, to click that and then insert their data through that survey, which auto-populates here. This is really great. This is how our leadership in the division has asked us to share out our end-of-year assessment in a really concise way. So pretty much now when people submit their results from their particular assessment, it facilitates and aggregates in this one area, and that's something we can easily share across the division, which is really great. So when we're thinking about designed experience, we wanted to make sure that each thing that we've identified with our leadership team is really being looked at through the lens that we want it to. So at the bottom level, if we're looking at occupancy reports, for instance, that's really an operational outcome at its lowest level. So through that, we want to make sure we're looking at our department learning outcomes. So how does that impact one of the 5 learning outcomes that we have? And do we need to collect more information, or how can we use the information we currently have differently to inform that? And then we know at Boise State, we value as a division the retention, recruitment, and employability of our students. So which one of those 3 is it driving through? And how is it assisting the values that our division holds? And then ultimately, we have a set of 10 learning outcomes that we commit to at the institutional level, 5 of which are non-academic. So how through one of those 5 are we really meeting what we need to at the institutional, divisional, and departmental level? This really helped us parse down some of the unnecessary or non-important information that we had historically been collecting. It really made sure that we were laser focused on what was best. So to show you an example of that, we facilitated a conduct assessment rubric that our professional hearing, our staff that are hearing officers do to assess after the fact that a student comes in and has a conversation with them. So in terms of the department learning outcome, we know that this will give us some data and information to drive our third learning outcome, which is students will be able to describe how they influence others in their communities in which they live or interact. We know that individuals who feel more connected to their community in a bigger way can really identify and resonate with retention. They tend to stay with us longer from year to year. So we know that through the assessment rubric, if we're identifying and processing with students how they're impacting their communities and having them be reflective on that, we could ultimately affect the relationships that are happening in the residence halls and impact retention, which ultimately leads us to the institutional learning outcome, university learning outcome number 3, which is engage in critical inquiry by defining problems, gathering and evaluating evidence, and implement innovative possible solutions, often as one member of a team. So with the designed experience, we're really trying to understand the intentionality and purpose behind each service or programmatic offering and get all team members on board with this. And this was a really great tool and practice to be able to do that. Ultimately, what I'm about to show you will act as a quick reference guide. So if an administrator that's higher up at the institution comes to us and they want to know what types of programs do we offer that are centered around drinking behaviors, and how can we prove how impactful our programs are. So in this particular case, what we created is sort of an interactive web. So on the left-hand side, what you're seeing is a portion of all 10 of the university learning outcomes. Across the top are our departmental learning outcomes. So we went through each programmatic service offering, each assessment, and we filled them in here. And I know it's a little hard to see because we color-coded it by functional area. So if, for instance, we wanted to see the intersection of university learning outcome number 3 and housing and residence life learning outcome number 1, so in cases where students would be able to describe their personal characteristics and also engage in effective critical inquiry in their communities, we know that we have intentional interaction logs, and that's what we've replaced some of our programmatic initiatives with. Our first year program for marketing and effectiveness, we know that we have our outcomes assessment rubric for conduct that we can provide some of that detail on. So ultimately, this is providing a really easy way for us to say, here's how we're impacting these, and here's how we're assessing these, and here's how our progress has looked over time. So next for us, once we had all of this, now we've outlined everything that we thought was important and valuable in terms of the types and abilities of the assessments that we are facilitating here in Housing Residence Life, we wanted to understand touch points. So now we're building a system. So the first question we wanted to ask was, do you know how your department is asking for information from students? So through this process, connecting with folks all the way down on the front lines, all the way up to the leadership in the department, we wanted to see how often we were, quote unquote, creating these touch points or these experiences where we were asking something from students. Ultimately, we care more about the quality of our data rather than the quantity. And so it was really important to make sure that our students were being responsive. This was born out of an accidental happening that happened here on our campus, where essentially we facilitated EBI Sky Factor, and in the same month we facilitated a campus leadership survey, and a lot of our students were really impacted by that as folks that live on campus. And so what resulted is a really poor EBI Sky Factor came first, and so a response rate was really low for the leadership survey that was served by our Student Involvement and Leadership Center here on campus. So we wanted to make sure that that wasn't happening again, so we wanted to be able to share this kind of information out with the division. So we also wanted to know how your department is interacting with students that utilize a program or service. So if we're interested, we want to make sure we're not like always collecting information via a survey that we send out in email. So we really wanted to make sure that we were varying it up a little bit. And this was a really great way to do that, looking at passive versus active versus survey versus clicks on our website, for instance. What kind of information were we pulling? And then how does it interact with those that don't? So how are we getting information about people who are not connected to us? And ultimately for us, the solution was to build something we called Becoming a Bronco. Bronco is our mascot here at Boise State. So it was a survey that kind of predicted some success and retention for our students that we utilize here in the hall. And then we also wanted to make sure that when we put all of our ducks in a row, that we're best positioned to be asking some of the questions that we do. So Sky Factor, for instance, provides us an opportunity to create 20 institution-specific questions. That seemed like historically a really great place for us to maybe gather some information for some of our campus partners, whether how often students are using the campus rec that live in residence life, or individuals who maybe utilize the university health center, for instance. But ultimately, asking one singular question that's utilizing maybe a Likert scale for this kind of stuff is really not providing anything that is going to illuminate how a student does that. So we may be not best positioned to ask those types of questions. So this exercise allowed us to kind of be reflective about that. So this is ultimately what that looked like. At the top, you'll see that each one of our functional areas is color-coded, and then we built it out by month. So we know that we're asking or getting some piece of information from students there on the left-hand column. In the middle, we're looking at collection frequency. So even though we're breaking it down by month, we want to know how often we're asking for this information. This is also really helpful in a department where there's a lot of people, and maybe a resident director doesn't necessarily know the initiatives or the types of projects that a director of the department is doing. They can look at this and they can say, oh, I know that we're doing a critical reflection of our occupancy reports at a high level once every 2 weeks in leadership team meetings. And I can go to this person to ask those questions. And then we also, through this process, committed to how we're sharing out, which I'll talk about in a little moment. And then all the way on the right of the screen, we were able to calculate how many times we were, from either a specific student population or all of housing in total, pull these touch points out from students. And for us, almost every month average, we were asking something of our students about 10 times on a higher level or collective scale. So once we get all this information, it is really mission critical that we share this back out with the students, because we started seeing feedback in some of our historical documentation and assessment, especially through EBI Sky Factor, that students were like, I've lived here for 3 years and I've provided the same feedback for 3 years, and they perceived it to be reasonable, and I've seen no follow-up, I've got no communication, I don't know what's happening with this. So we wanted to make sure that the feedback loops were happening. For instance, we had some students share that they felt that one of our residence halls was a little gloomy, and that it wasn't very pleasant to walk through the space. This information ultimately got shared with our president. Our president circled back around with us and asked us to do some painting. So because we never got back to that student, they shared it out in a different way that was probably not ideal for us as a department. So the question was, what's the feedback loop? How does this work? How are we identifying some peers across our division and across the institution that might benefit from either the assessments we're doing or our process? What does it look like to communicate that information back to them? Because that's also important. And then how can we start putting this in a way that is developing this collective narrative across the division? So for us here at Boise State, we really wanted to empower and encourage our student leaders to take a more active role in assessment in our communities and sharing out some of the really cool things that we're excited we're doing. And so we tapped RHA and we got them involved. And our Residential Housing Association was really a driving force in connecting with the hall councils in each of our residence halls and making sure that we were talking openly in our communities about some of the things that are coming. So if there was a specific issue, for instance, with washers and dryers in our residence halls, that information was both recognized that it had been heard by somebody in our department, and then if there was an opportunity for us to do something about that, what that might look like and how quickly that could happen. This is also connected too with hall councils and some of the budget that we give them. Do they have the ability to make some changes in their own residence halls for their residents? So with that, I just want to leave you with a couple final thoughts and then open up some space for questions. So it's really important that we keep all assessment as simple as possible. I think we, even as administrators or people who are facilitating some pieces to assessment, we tend to overcomplicate it, and at the end of the day, we need to open our doors and do a lot more listening, and a lot less worrying about what the data looks like at the end of the day, because we're really much more concerned with the story that our students tell than being able to say 23% response rate on X, Y, and Z in most situations. I encourage you to make sure that everyone is involved and connected in your department, and then garner those relationships outside of your department as well, across the division. I think there's a lot of information that we're all getting, and I'm willing to bet that a lot of it overlaps quite consistently. So how can we be more efficient in our assessment collection efforts? I challenge you to think about whether or not you are best positioned to collect the types of information that maybe you're asking. Is it really pertinent to the mission, vision, and values that you have in your department? And is it also feeding information through the learning outcomes that you've created? And if in part of that your answer is no, I'd also challenge you to think, are the learning outcomes or the mission and vision and values that we've created here in our department, are those the kinds of things that we actually want, or do we need to revisit that collectively? I also want you to think about students and the types of information that they are being asked. So sure, as I showed you, for us, we have about 10 touch points a month on average with our students, but they're also interacting with student involvement and leadership, our diversity initiatives. So they're interacting with a lot of campus partners. So how can we shore up that communication? We are not asking too much of our students at the end of the day, because they'll just stop responding. And then how are we going to share this back? So there's really 3 components to that. It's really important that you're sharing with your students what progress is happening, validating that you've heard them. It's important to validate your staff as well. I'm really all for transparency as it makes sense in your department and as is responsible. And then also with your campus partners too. So I think we have a tendency to become siloed, and just remember, and I encourage you to think critically about being one university collectively, because that's how we show up to the student. And then this is my overarching point, which I connected to at the beginning, is really you need to be messy, you need to play with assessment, you need to find what works for you and your department. And it's okay to do bad assessment. It's okay to find that maybe this wasn't the best way to do it, or this didn't resonate with your students. That's part of the process, and ultimately what you're going to come out with at the end of the day is a really shiny, polished, good fit for you on your campus. So I welcome any questions, any feedback via email today. I'm really excited I got to share this with you all. Yeah, I turn it over to you all.
Thank you, Taylor, for that presentation. One question that we have in the system is, can you talk a little bit more about those 10 touch points per month that you referenced in the last slide to each student? What do those look like?
Sure. So with the touch points, these were things that we identified with, so we started working up, like, what do you do in your role? Then next, what do we do in our unit or our functional area? So all the functional areas are color-coded there at the top. And then I sat down with leadership and I said, okay, so what are the important pieces of information we're garnering from all this? So all of the touch points that you see there on the left-hand side are actual physical pieces of assessment that we collect from students. So for instance, we have advocate reporting. So I daily get a digest of all the student conduct cases that we get. And that ultimately feeds into a semester report and an annual report that talks about the types and kinds and frequency of behaviors that are happening in our residence halls. So the importance here was, if I am collecting that frequency, and if the frequency is daily, and then I share that out at the end of the year, and we get feedback on Sky Factor, for instance, that says people don't feel safe in our residence halls. I know, as the leader in that functional area, that I really need to focus and spend some time on creating maybe programs in the hall about responsible communities, or facilitating more restorative justice dialoguing in our halls, for instance. So I know that this is where I'm getting some information from regarding student conduct. Or, for instance, our expenditure reporting. So this comes out of our business office. So that's shared with the leadership team on a monthly basis. It lets us know where our spending is. It can drive some of our ideas for programmatic initiatives. If we know that we're going to end up with a pile of money at the end of the semester, is there something that we can do to reframe that money to give back to our students? Is there a need that's not being met elsewhere, or something that they would like, ranging from maybe new game systems in the residence halls all the way to like getting the rights to touch Beauty and the Beast, to getting the rights to show Beauty and the Beast like we are this Friday, with some extra funds that we found. So these are all just data points that are exported on a monthly basis, that we're getting information from students, and then we're sharing that back out in the department that we deemed to be most important. Does that answer the question about touch points? I want to make sure I was getting to the heart of that question. And I know it's chat, so that's challenging.
I guess we'll wait to see if they type into the chat feature at all to see if that did or not. If not, also feel free to reach out to Taylor directly to his email, which we can get out to everybody. As a reminder, you can use either the chat feature or the questions feature on the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen to ask Taylor any questions you have in regards to his presentation. Seeing none at this point, we just want to take our time to thank Taylor again for taking the time to share your knowledge in this area. The association really appreciates what you do for our members. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be posted on our AIMHO 365 YouTube page, and that link is available through the aimho.org website for future review, so please feel free to pull it back up as you're working on your assessment plans, or just wanting to do some professional development training for yourselves or your departments. Be sure to be on the lookout for future webinars by checking the AIMHO 365 page on the AIMHO website. We do have several coming up in the next coming months. And then once we close this webinar, there will be an online survey that will appear on your screen. If you wouldn't mind taking a few moments to complete it, we'd greatly appreciate it. So again, Taylor, thank you so much from the region for your time and your knowledge on this presentation today. We really appreciate it. Again, it was recorded and will be up, so feel free to check it out online or reach out to Taylor directly for any more information. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you.